Welcome to Episode 2 of Iraq War 2003. I'm your narrator, Frank H. Wallis, Ph.D. Today I'm going to talk about corporatism, petroleum, and Bush II. This episode will show the links between corporatism, the petroleum industry, and the Bush administration. Along the way, it will be necessary to explore the way Washington works via interest groups and sub-government. The link to Iraq 2003 was in the historically unprecedented relationship of the fossil fuel industry, and especially the petroleum industry, to the Bush administration with its strategic vision for the Persian Gulf. Material interests matter in geopolitics and cannot be ignored as a primary cause of the Iraq War in 2003. Corporatism seeks to explain the relationship among big business organizations as they collaborate with politicians, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, and members of the White House. Corporatism was the invention of Republican businessmen such as Herbert Hoover in the 1920s, who advocated a greater role for the private sector and the control of the economy via private trade associations and professional societies. They wanted to integrate all national economies into U.S.-dominated world capitalist order. Foreign relations were to be an affair of private experts and non-state actors with the support of the government, and such examples would be the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NATO. Corporatism in practice is not apolitical. Some research has pointed out that the largest corporations have the largest share of decision-making in American trade associations, despite democratic internal governance. The biggest contributors get to send their officers to serve on governing boards, and they determine association policies. Large firms are under the leadership of only a few key executives, usually Republicans with deep pockets for campaign contributions. The corporatist scheme could not operate without corporations. The success of American multinational corporations in the 20th century was a result of their support from the United States government. The multinational is a business that invests in other countries for the purpose of lower cost of production and access to foreign markets. The destination of offshore production is usually the United States. The strategy of multinational corporations is to use foreign direct investment to build up foreign branches or buy out foreign competitors. Multinationals are companies in which management, ownership, and production range across international borders, with headquarters located in the United States, creating long-term and long-distance political relationships. The essence of the American multinational has been American managerial control over foreign economies. At the core of this international system of multinationals, the United States acted as a banker and regulator for the periphery, extracting natural resources for the American core consumer. Multinationals use foreign direct investment to preserve capital and avoid being left behind. Fixed exchange rates and the high security of the U.S. dollar mean American multinationals could invest at more favorable terms than could foreigners, borrowing at lower interest rates. Tax avoidance is a U.S. government-sanctioned policy whereby multinationals use foreign direct investment as a method of growth and profit at the expense of the American taxpayer. American oil companies operate foreign subsidiaries whose earnings are taxed in the United States only when they are distributed in the United States. This is called tax deferral. Shifting tax liability by transferring the price of goods or services in one branch to another branch allows the multinational parent to show a loss in a high tax rate country and show a profit in a low tax rate country. U.S. tax law acts to buttress large monopolies regardless of antitrust laws, and has done so since the Truman era. But where, you might ask, is the link between U.S. corporatist empire and American multinationals? The latter are willing instruments of U.S. government hegemony and are not independent actors. Neither do they dictate foreign policy. Rather, the multinationals and the government share overlapping interests and cooperate, because corporate elites and U.S. government elites share a common vision of world economic order under American domination. This involves maintaining United States' share of world markets, gaining more markets, and controlling resource flows, especially petroleum. This is critical to the financing of U.S. government imperialism, and the most lucrative source of their foreign direct investment was the Middle East, and primarily the oil sector. The benefits of the multinational come from the export of American capital and the creation of foreign partners who share American values. The fossil fuel industry played a key role in shaping U.S. government energy and geostrategic vision under Bush II. The critical distinction between 1903 and 2003 was that the economic interests which guided the American empire into the 21st century were from just one sector, the fossil fuel sector, and in preference to territorial rule, it required access and stability in the Persian Gulf. The crude imperial methods of the 19th century were not necessary to achieve the goals of the fossil fuel collective in America. But this did not rule out regime change and war. The ultimate decision would be in the hands of Bush II, who was a member in good standing of the Fossil Fuel Collective, an interest group outside of government, but it was part of government. So the term for that set of lobbyists, politicians, lawyers, businessmen, public relations firms, and appointed government officers who served the oil, natural gas, and coal industries, plus electric utilities, as the Fossil Fuel Collective. 9 days before Bush II was inaugurated, energy company lobbyists met at the American Petroleum Institute in Washington. They drew up their list of measures that the new administration would be taking on behalf of the Fossil Fuel Collective. They then gave this list to Bush's transition team. On March 20th, 2001, they sent the list to the Energy Task Force under Vice President Dick Cheney. Several members of the API became Bush II appointees. J. Stephen Griles, a coal mining lobbyist, went to work at the Interior Department, which supposedly regulates mining on federal lands. Thomas Sansonetti, an energy lawyer, was named top officer for the environment at the Justice Department, which is supposed to prosecute cases against energy polluters. From 1999 to 2001, Sansonetti lobbied for 3 of the biggest coal producers in the United States. Before that, he had been chair of the Wyoming GOP and worked for both Reagan and Bush I in the Interior Department. In 2001, he was part of Interior's transition team, helping pick government officials in charge of regulating his former coal clients. Sansonetti, like many other conservative government haters, was a member of the anti-federal Federalist Society. Members of the little-known National Petroleum Council had been giving advice to the new regime. This had been created as a quasi-presidential advisory group under Harry Truman in the 1940s, but by the time of Bush II, it was an unofficial lobbying group of the oil industry. In February of 2001, 3 months before the Bush-Cheney report on energy, the United States Energy Association published a 56-page wish list. There was almost no need for a new government report because private industry had already detailed what they wanted. The U.S. EA, like the NPC, represents public and private energy-related organizations, corporations, and government agencies. Members of the USEA came from the Electric Power Research Institute, the Nuclear Energy Institute, the American Public Power Association, the American Petroleum Institute, the National Mining Association, the American Gas Association, and the Edison Electric Institute. The Bush-Cheney Energy Plan had a unique place in presidential history as the only major energy policy initiative to be conducted in complete secrecy, kept away from public input or congressional scrutiny. Bush II had appointed Vice President Dick Cheney to be head of the National Energy Policy Development Group, which conducted private meetings with corporate leaders and lobbyists for 3 months, issuing their final report in May of 2001. Secrecy was part of Cheney's government theory. There were 5 components to that theory. First, lying is a state necessity. Second, The people are too stupid to be trusted with insider information. Third, preemptive war in favor of the petroleum industry. Fourth, neutrality is evil. Fifth, civil liberties do not matter. The roster of the Cheney Group was the who's who of the American energy industry. Cheney had been CEO of Halliburton, the oil services company. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill was CEO of ALCOA, one of the biggest aluminum conglomerates on the planet, heavily dependent on electricity rates. Energy Secretary Spencer Abraham was a defeated one-term Michigan senator, funded by the Detroit automobile industry. Joe Albaugh, Director, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, participated in Cheney meetings concerned with electricity deregulation, a special concern of his wife, Diane, a registered lobbyist for mega-billion-dollar corporations Reliant Energy and TXU. Bush colleague Don Evans was Commerce Secretary, and a former CEO of Colorado-based Tom Brown, an oil and gas company. Interior Secretary Gail Norton was a coal mining lawyer, and her Deputy Secretary, J. Stephen Griles, had worked in the Reagan administration working for James Watt, where they allowed the coal industry to evade prohibitions against mountaintop removal. Out of government, Griles had been a coal mining lobbyist in Washington. Other Cheney Group members included Joseph Kelliher, a Department of Energy official who had been a nuclear power lobbyist. Bush II's Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, Joshua Bolten, had been Executive Director, Legal and Government Affairs Officer at Goldman Sachs International, a major power trader. Other Bush II officials had been part of the power industry. Andrew Card, the President's Chief of Staff, earned almost $500,000 as chief lobbyist for General Motors and reported assets of over $2 million in 2000. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice owned stock worth $500,000 in Chevron and earned $60,000 as board member of the company. Clay Johnson, Director of Presidential Personnel, reported stock holding in El Paso Energy Partners at $250,000. El Paso is a Houston oil and natural gas company. Johnson helped fill vacancies at FERC, which oversees the natural gas market. Karl Rove, Bush's brain, held $250,000 in Enron stock. Other Enron insiders were made prominent in the Bush II regime. Robert Zoellick was an Enron consultant and became U.S. Trade Representative. Marc Racicot was an Enron lobbyist and became chairman of the Republican Party. Lewis Libby, Cheney's chief of staff, held stock in Texaco, ExxonMobil, and Chesapeake Energy, as well as Enron. It is no surprise that the Cheney Group requested no meetings with groups who work for sustainable energy and a healthy environment. Thomas Kuhn, a roommate of Bush II at Yale in the 1960s, was president of the Edison Electric Institute, an association of investor-owned electric companies whose members generate and distribute 3/4 of the electricity in the United States. He acted as Bush II's campaign manager in 2000. Before that, he had been president of the American Nuclear Energy Council. Big industry had the most access to the Cheney Group, with industry representatives having 714 direct contacts, while non-industry representatives had only 29. The petroleum industry has two geostrategic imperatives. First, access to land for drilling, which entails conformity to property laws and taxation policies. The state has to be paid off anywhere on the globe. Second, like sharks that need to be in constant motion, oil companies search for more petroleum reserves because frightened stock portfolio managers rate oil companies on the basis of their proven reserves. Share prices can decline when investors lose confidence in an oil company's future output. By the 1990s, American oil companies had a return on investment from their non-OPEC reserves of between 9 and 12%, as compared with 43% in the 1960s. These shrinking profit margins led to mega mergers in the 1990s. Exxon with Mobil, Chevron with Texaco, Conoco with Phillips, BP with Amoco. The majors wanted greater access to Persian Gulf oil. But the existing political regimes in those countries did not always allow this. The election of Bush II in 2000 presented the fossil fuel industry with an unprecedented opportunity for an advancement in their material interest in this regard. Most Americans were dependent on personal vehicular transport for survival in daily life. They preferred this costly, inefficient, and unhealthy existence and did not consider alternatives. Americans spend hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of their lives on the purchase, taxation, insurance, fueling, and upkeep of personal transport, and don't give it a second thought. Material interest of Americans in their transport preference and the material interest of big American oil companies were going to have a powerful impact on Iraq in 2003. Material interests give rise to ideology. What kind of ideas did Bush II have about energy? What did the report of the National Energy Policy Development Group have to say? Cheney admitted that oil accounted for almost 90% of net U.S. energy imports, and two-thirds of that was consumed by the transport sector. Although American oil companies lost their nearly 100% tax subsidy in the 1970s, U.S. oil and gas companies had at least 882 subsidiaries located in tax havens such as the Cayman Islands and Liechtenstein. At least 6 American oil and gas companies had reincorporated in these tax havens, not only to escape U.S. taxes, but to shelter their profits in complex offshore transactions, reducing their tax rates from 35% to 0. The largest set of recommendations in the Cheney report involved the exploitation of Persian Gulf assets. The United States must increase investment in oil sectors in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Algeria, Qatar, UAE, and other suppliers. Other suppliers, meaning Iraq. With Saudi Arabia, the Bush family was entwined with the ruling house of Saud, more closely and at greater danger to the United States than any other family in America. Since the first contacts with Bush I in the 1970s, the Bush clan had received at least $1.4 billion from Saudi fossil fuel contacts and deals with the Bin Ladin Group. Cheney was also linked to the House of Saud through Halliburton. That U.S. energy policy was connected with an Islamist regime which ignored anti-American terrorists such as Al-Qaeda was ironic at best. The refusal of Bush-Cheney to consider rational means of reducing oil dependency would have fatal consequences in the Middle East for both Iraqi and American victims of intervention policy. The not very visible link between Bush II, Congress, and the fossil fuel collective goes by different names. One of the older ones is called sub-government. It basically means alliances composed of government officials and key agents from industry outside of the government. Oil sub-government operated largely outside of government control with the fragmentation of U.S. government agencies devoted to oil, Department of State, Department of Justice, Interior, making it easier for the oil sub-government to exercise power. The president certainly had no time to coordinate all the decisions of the oil industry. Sub-government knew how to build public support through influence in the press. Locating the center of power in Washington is futile. Power there does not operate according to textbook hierarchies. Each interested sector has a role, official and unofficial. Policies are usually written by senior staff in the executive or in Congress, and these staffers come from interested sectors of the economy. Power is about building coalitions. Thus, gaining the intellectual initiative can be important. Unofficial power in Washington consists of information, knowledge, timing, showmanship, victory, and the illusion of power. Lobbyists insinuate themselves into the survival networks of congressmen and senators, helping them with money, influence, and information. Lobbyists help staff write legislation or speeches for congressmen and senators. The politician who accepts money from a lobbyist or political action committee has made an implicit bargain and has signified by his acceptance of money that he recognizes the interest of the lobbyist. And why do corporations and lobbyists give so much money to politicians? One word: access, which means the opportunity to communicate with the decision makers. who gets what, when, and where, especially money from the federal government. The center of this access maze is the Oval Office. Whoever saw the president last can be critical for the success of policy decisions. It has been said that whoever controls information controls policy, so being cut out of the access loop can be devastating. Interest groups are based on shared attitudes and make claims on other groups in society. Although usually associated with social causes, they are also geared towards the fossil fuel industry and lobby the president, Congress, or the public. They can be one of three types: self-oriented towards material interests, public interest, benefiting the general public, or public interest front organizations for self-oriented interest groups. In the Bush era, there were almost 4,000 business and trade interest groups in Washington, D.C. alone. Conservative Republicans had the advantage here as wealthy ideologues such as Richard Scaife helped launch and sustain 25 interest groups. For example, Accuracy in Media, Heritage Foundation, Free Congress, Committee on the Present Danger, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Congress itself had become a transactional institution, not very much concerned with foreign policy, too distracted to oppose Bush II and his invasion of Iraq. Between the Clinton and Bush eras, the Fossil Fuel Collective invested more than $440 million on politicians, political parties, and lobbyists in order to protect its interest in Washington. $381 million went to lobbyists. $67 million went to campaign contributions in federal elections. Republican candidates received 75% of these funds. During this period, big oil companies expended the most money on politicians and lobbyists by far. But in the scale of a $1 trillion oil industry, it's astonishing to see how little expense was incurred on the part of the collective as it purchased influence in the halls of imperial power. In conclusion, links between corporatism, the petroleum industry, and Bush II, hardened by way of interest groups and the oil sub-government. Money talks, apparently, and the Fossil Fuel Collective had plenty to spread around Washington. At the Imperial American Corps, the Emperor-President had risen to the apex of power, out of the oil patch. He and his closest advisors were alumni of the petroleum industry. The first major item of business was to coordinate energy policy using the government to carry out regulatory, foreign policy, and national security regimes in line with private fossil fuel interests. A closer relationship between the government and private corporate interests could not be imagined. It remains to be seen in the following episodes how this policy bias played out in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the subsequent expedition to Iraq. This is your Empire historian, Frank H. Wallis, Ph.D. Thank you for listening and thinking.